Listen to Genesis 50, beginning with the 15th verse. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now, therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way, he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There are certain stories that human beings tell over and over again. The characters change, the nations change, the political parties change, the churches change, the families change, but somehow we keep finding ourselves living the same stories. Gareth Higgins and Brian McLaren, in their book, The Seventh Story, identify 6 recurring stories. They call them stories of domination, of revolution, of isolation, of purification, of accumulation, and of victimization. They are different stories, but underneath them is the same basic assumption. There is an us and there is a them. And if we are going to be safe, if we're going to prosper, if we're going to have peace, then somehow we have to do something about them. I think we know the domination story well enough already. We have to dominate them in order to have peace, prosperity, security. And the story is throughout the Bible, with God offering an alternative story to domination. And over the next 4 weeks, I want us to look at the other stories and ask if Jesus might be inviting us to live a different story than the 6 stories of domination and I went 4, I wanted to go back. Then the 6 stories of revolution and domination and isolation and purification and accumulation and victimization. I wonder if Jesus is inviting us to live a 7th story, a different one than those normal stories. So today we begin with the 2nd story. We're going to look at the 2nd story after domination, what Higgins and McLaren call the revolution story. After domination, usually there's a revolution in response to the domination. And the revolution isn't necessarily a bad word. Sometimes things desperately need to change. The problem comes when revolution becomes revenge. The revolution story says they've been on top too long. It's our turn to be on top. They've pushed us around. They've humiliated us. They've taken advantage of us. They've hurt us. Just wait till we have the power. then the tables will turn. We'll be on top. And when the tables turn, and we'll do to them what they did to us, the people just change places. But the story doesn't change. It just becomes reverse domination. Gareth Higgins knows something about that story because he grew up in Northern Ireland during what became known as the Troubles. Decades of conflict involving British and Irish identity, Protestants and Catholics, Unionists and Nationalists. Thousands of people were killed, tens of thousands were physically injured, countless others carried emotional wounds. And Higgins uses an image to describe what happens in that kind of conflict. Imagine a table, and one group has been sitting comfortably at the table with power, and another group has been pushed down underneath the table. And if you spent generations under the table, what do? You flip the table, and who could blame you? You turn it over, and now the people who are on top are underneath the table, and the people who are underneath are on top. And perhaps it feels like justice. Except there's a problem. There's still somebody underneath the table. The characters have changed, but the story hasn't. Peace doesn't come when our side defeats their side. It begins when we can imagine us and them as part of a larger us. It begins with an alternative to just flipping the table and putting those on top under those who had been on the bottom. Instead, we can make the table bigger. We can invite more people to participate in setting the table. We can make room for more people. It isn't our table instead of their table, us above and them below. It's love's table. The table we're invited to sit around together. As I read about the domination story in the 7th story, I thought about Joseph at the end of the book of Genesis. Because Joseph has the opportunity to flip the table. The story actually begins long before Joseph. Genesis tells story after story about human desire turning into rivalry and rivalry turning into violence. Cain and Abel are brothers competing for God's favor, and Cain dominates Abel by killing him. Jacob and Esau are brothers competing for their father's blessing, and their rivalry nearly ends in violence when Jacob steals what was Esau's. And then Jacob has 12 sons. And Jacob does something parents should know better than to do. He has a favorite son. Out of the 12, it's Joseph, and he doesn't exactly keep it a secret. He gives Joseph the famous coat of many colors, and Joseph doesn't seem to mind being the favorite son either. He tells his brothers of his dreams in which they bow down to him because he's the favorite. The domination of Joseph over his brothers leads to jealousy, rivalry, resentment, violence. The brothers decide to kill Joseph, bring down the favored brother who dominates them. And one brother talks them out of murder, so they choose something only slightly better. They sell him as a slave to foreigners. Whatever Joseph's youthful arrogance may have contributed to the dysfunction of this family, let's be clear, Joseph is a victim. His brothers do something terrible to him. And because of his brother's action, Joseph loses his family, his home, his freedom. For many chapters in Genesis, Joseph's life takes one turn after another until eventually this Hebrew slave becomes one of the most powerful people in Egypt. And as Joseph predicted, there are 7 years of famine throughout Egypt and the surrounding lands. And one day, Joseph's starving brothers travel to Egypt and appear before him looking for food. And the brothers who once held Joseph's life in their hands are now standing before Joseph, and Joseph holds their lives in his hands. The table has turned. The ones on top of the table are now underneath, and vice versa. And then their father Jacob dies, and the brothers become terrified. They maybe thought, Joseph hasn't taken revenge on us because our father was still alive. But now Dad's gone. And they think, here comes his revenge. Turning the tables in the Revolution story always seems to lead to vengeance. So they send Joseph a message saying that before their father died, he told them to tell Joseph to forgive him. Maybe he did tell him. Maybe he didn't, but the brothers are desperate. They fall down before Joseph and say, we are here as your slaves. Did you notice the revolution and how the tables turned? Earlier, the brothers made Joseph a slave. Now they offer themselves as his slaves. It's the normal revolution cycle. You enslave me, I'll enslave you. You made me suffer, I'll make you suffer. You put me underneath the table, I have the power, and I'll put you underneath the table. But Joseph changes. Joseph refuses to continue the revolution story. Joseph breaks the cycle of revolution and revenge when he says this incredible sentence, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Am I in the place of God? I believe that question that occurs in the last sentences of Genesis takes us back to the first sentences of Genesis. Remember the Garden of Eden? The temptation is to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The temptation is to take God's place, to be like God, to believe we possess knowledge that allows us to make the final judgment about good and evil, about who deserves blessing and who deserves punishment. And now Joseph is in a position where he can make life and death judgments about his brothers, whether they're free or enslaved, whether they eat or die. And Joseph asks, am I in the place of God? And it's a rhetorical question. The answer is obviously no, you're not in the place of God. I'm not like to be like God in the story of revolution and revenge. I'm not to eat of the fruit of the tree that makes me like God. But notice what Joseph does not say. He doesn't say, oh, forget about it. It wasn't that bad. He doesn't say, oh, boys will be boys. He doesn't say, everything happens for a reason. He doesn't say, oh, I guess we all make mistakes. Joseph says, you intended harm for me. He names it. You hurt me. You betrayed me. You sold me as an enslaved person. What you did was wrong. That's important. Because sometimes Christians have confused forgiveness with pretending evil doesn't matter. Forgiveness leads to restorative justice, but neither forgiveness nor restorative justice says that the harm that was done doesn't matter. Restorative justice doesn't mean there are no boundaries. There are no rules of right and wrong. It doesn't mean there are no consequences. It doesn't mean victims should remain in dangerous situations. The first responsibility when someone is being harmed is to stop the harm, protect the vulnerable, tell the truth about what happened, listen to those who were harmed, hold people accountable, and seek to repair what needs to be repaired. And Joseph doesn't imitate the desire of his brothers. Joseph imitates the desire of God. You desired harm for me, but Joseph doesn't harm them back. They enslaved him. He does not enslave them. They threatened his life. He preserves their life. They tore the family apart, and Joseph puts the family back together. And in doing so, Joseph has to give something up. Joseph gives up revenge. There are things his brothers can never give back to him. They cannot give him back the years he lost. They cannot undo the pit. They cannot undo the slave caravan. They cannot erase what happened. Joseph has every opportunity to make them pay for what they stole from him, but he gives up that right to make their suffering the payment for his suffering. He gives up revenge. And maybe that's one of the hardest sacrifices peace requires. It requires us to give up revenge, to sacrifice our revenge. Not to sacrifice the truth, not to sacrifice justice, not to sacrifice protecting people from harm, to sacrifice my chance at revenge. Instead, peace and reconciliation require the sacrifice of the belief that I must hurt you because I was hurt. Joseph doesn't allow what his brothers did to determine what he will do to them. That's the turning point. Retaliation and revenge feel so natural to us. It's part of our 6 stories we all know and live. You hurt me and I hurt you. You insult me, I insult you. Your political side attacks mine, mine attacks you. Your nation bombs mine, mine bombs yours. And before long, nobody remembers exactly how it started. Everybody just knows they did it first. We have seen people try another way. Not perfectly, but courageously. When apartheid finally ended in South Africa, there was every reason for the people who had suffered under that brutal system to want to flip the table and take revenge. Nelson Mandela had spent 27 years in prison. Black South Africans had been denied rights, removed from their homes, imprisoned, tortured, killed, just because of the color of their skin. And then the tables turned. Apartheid ended. Nelson Mandela became president. South Africa faced Joseph's question, what do you do when the people who hurt you are finally in your power? And South Africa tried a different story. They created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was chaired by Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Notice that first word, truth. Archbishop Tutu said they couldn't simply say bygones will be bygones. The wounds had to be opened and cleansed or they'd continue to fester. Victims came and told what had happened to them. Perpetrators came or were invited to come and tell the truth about the atrocities they had done. And it was painful. And it was controversial. And it wasn't perfect. Some victims believed there was reconciliation without enough accountability or reparation. Some perpetrators simply chose not to speak the truth about their actions. But they were trying to find a different way, a different story, a story that was different than revolution and revenge. Tutu spoke of restorative justice. Instead of asking only how should the guilty be punished, restorative justice asks what has been broken, who has been wounded, what needs to be restored, and how. How in the world do we keep yesterday's violence from becoming tomorrow's violence? Tutu connected this with the African idea of Ubuntu. Ubuntu means my humanity is inextricably bound up in your humanity. If I destroy your humanity, I diminish my own. During apartheid, while Tutu was preaching at St. George's Cathedral, security police were watching the anti-apartheid activists for something to arrest them for. And Tutu could have named them as enemies in the sermon. Instead, he invited them to change. He invited those security police to join the struggle for injustice, for justice, and make amends. He was saying, what you're doing is wrong, but you don't have to remain my enemy. There can still be a place for you in the future we're trying to create. That's making a bigger table for everyone, instead of turning the table upside down. Yesterday we were on top, now we're underneath. Justice cannot simply mean that today I get to be on top and you have to live underneath. That's the same story of domination, revolution, and revenge that doesn't work. It's never worked, but we keep doing it. Instead of that story, we know too well that story throughout history. We seek to tell an alternative story. We seek to ask, not can we build a table with some on top and some on the bottom, but can we build a different table? Which brings us to Jesus. Jesus lives in a world dominated by empire. Rome understands domination. They got really good at it. And many people living under Roman domination understandably dream of a revolution where they'll flip the table, defeat Rome, let God destroy our enemies, and put us back on top. But Jesus doesn't merely teach another story, he lives it. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Blessed are the peacemakers. The greatest among you will be your servant. And living that story leads to Jesus being betrayed, arrested, humiliated, tortured, crucified. The powers of domination do their worst. And the different ending is resurrection. This is when we'd expect God to take vengeance and retribution on those who conspire to crucify Jesus. But God transforms the story of retribution and revenge into the new life of Easter. God transforms the domination and revenge into resurrection. I mean, imagine the risen Christ saying, all right, I tried love, I tried forgiveness, I tried peace, and you crucified me. Now it's my turn. Watch out. Here I come. My revenge will wipe out all of you. That's not the resurrection story. Instead, it's almost as if Jesus says, let's keep a different story alive. Jesus sends his followers into the world not to avenge his death. He doesn't send them out to crucify the crucifiers. He sends them out to continue the story, a story in which violence doesn't get the last word, a story in which hatred doesn't get the last word, a story in which death doesn't get the last word. Instead, love gets the last word. We've seen it over and over again what doesn't work, and Jesus shows us the story that does. Not a world where injustice doesn't matter, where evil is ignored without accountability. Instead, Jesus shows us a world where we refuse to believe that the only way to defeat violence is with greater violence, where the person who's been underneath doesn't have to be the person who puts someone else underneath, where retribution isn't complete until our enemy hurts as much as we do. 7th story uses a phrase I keep thinking about. Some of us for all of us. Not some of us against the rest of us, some of us for all of us. Joseph stands before his brothers who betrayed him when he has the power to dominate them and says, "Am I in the place of God? You intended harm for me, but do not be afraid." And then he says, "I will provide for you and your little ones." Joseph doesn't just refrain from killing them, he feeds them. He doesn't merely turn the table, he makes room for them at the larger table. Finally, the 7th story is a better alternative to the other 6 we usually tell, because it's all about love. Love chooses restoration over revenge, reconciliation over retaliation, abundant life over getting even. When the table turns, love doesn't flip the table with new ones underneath. Love makes the bigger tables bigger. And why is that? Because in the 7th story, we are not the protagonist. Love is the protagonist. Love is the 7th story. Amen.